I think I need to say a few words about Charlie Kirk's death. I wasn't going to talk about it because I don't care. Charlie Kirk was an awful person in life, and he remains an awful person in death. That doesn't justify his murder, but it is what it is, and he was who he was. Political violence is a worthwhile topic to talk about for sure, but if I were to talk about political violence, it would be the violence directed at vulnerable minorities, not violence that blows back into the faces of ghouls like Charlie Kirk who instigate that kind of violence in the first place. I would probably talk first and foremost about the Trump administration's state-run concentration camps, or the American Gestapo ICE, which rounds up brown people to put in the camps. And secondly, I would talk about the right's fundamentally violent ideology that leads to stochastic violence against trans people, for example, or down the line leads to death camps. I wouldn't talk about Charlie fucking Kirk. He was an unapologetic transphobe, misogynist, racist, and just all-round fascist scumbag who radicalized so many young men into a violent and hateful ideology. Even at the event where he was murdered, he was there to talk about how all the degenerate trans people are a threat to society, so I wasn't going to talk about it. However, now I feel like I need to comment on it. Specifically, I want to say something about the European far-right's reaction to Charlie Kirk's death. But you can't do that without first saying a few words about Charlie Kirk's death. So, here goes. He's dead. After a career of hate-mongering and pushing violent narratives about minorities, someone shot him dead. The reaction afterwards was as predictable as stink on a fart. Spineless liberals have paid more homage to brave truth-teller Charlie Kirk than they did to their own colleague, Democratic lawmaker Melissa Hortman, who was, along with her husband, murdered by a deranged Trump supporter, just a few short months before Kirk. And the American far-right has been frothing at the mouth at the thought of mass arresting everyone they disagree with now that their hero, free speech warrior Charlie Kirk, was murdered. You know, because far-right weirdos whose entire ideology is just an expression of violence toward the groups of people they don't like have now discovered the term stochastic violence and think that everyone who disagreed with Charlie or accurately described him as a white nationalist stochastically violenced him with their mean words. Even though it is looking more likely by the day that the shooter was an internet-poisoned weirdo of the far-right Groyper variety, the far-right now wants to arrest all the radical left lunatics, as if they didn't before, to create a safe space for themselves. We've truly come full circle, except of course, no, we haven't, because the right was always the faction of crybullies who were all caught up in their hateful feelings and wanted to silence anyone who disagreed with them. Every accusation from a right-winger is a confession every time, without fail. The free speech shit was always just rhetoric. The cancel culture shit was always just rhetoric, a roundabout justification of their own violent hate. Because if you can't defend your hateful ideas on their own terms, on their own merits, then at least you can defend the abstract idea of ideas. Just to drive my point home, here's Joey Manarino, a political strategist and commentator with well over 600,000 followers on X, the Everything app, saying, quote, "If the person who killed Charlie Kirk was a transgender, there can be no mercy for that species any longer. We've tolerated far too much from those creatures," end quote. Yet I'm the one doing the stochastic violence if I call this fucker a fascist. And we can easily find countless examples of this exact kind of rhetoric from right-wingers from before the murder because their ideology is fundamentally hateful and violent. Charlie's death didn't change anything about that. And That's why the eulogization of Charlie Kirk rings so hollow to me. He was a hateful person, but that doesn't make a good eulogy. So, what all the liberals, conservatives, and establishment thinkers have done in their attempt to sanitize his image after his death is to reduce all he stood for into a flattened, romanticized virtue about the importance of conversations and sharing ideas. They can't romanticize that he told Taylor Swift to renounce feminism and submit to her fiancé like a good, obedient woman, because that's awful. They can't romanticize that he praised and wanted to bail out the lunatic who tried to murder Paul Pelosi with a hammer, because that's awful. They can't romanticize that he said gay people should be stoned to death according to God's perfect law, because that's awful. They can't romanticize that he said Muslims seek to destabilize our civilization, because that's awful. They can't romanticize what he was saying at the very event where he died, when he tried to falsely claim that trans people are responsible for most mass shootings, and that it is because of their transness, because that's awful. They can't romanticize his ideas because they were awful, but what they can romanticize is the idea of expressing ideas itself, as long as you pretend not to remember what ideas he specifically espoused. The thing is, that doesn't really work either, because Charlie Kirk, like all fascists, didn't believe in the virtue of exchanging ideas. Like all fascists, he used violent rhetoric, threats, and sometimes real violence by proxy through his supporters as means to force his regressive ideas on society. Journalist Stacey Patton wrote a lengthy Facebook post succinctly explaining exactly this. She says that Charlie Kirk had, through his organization Turning Point USA, a professor watch list that she was put on after her words, quote, inflamed the MAGA faithful, end quote. And lo and behold, afterwards she was relentlessly harassed with misogyny, racism, and threats of violence by right-wing freaks that tried to have her fired. It got so bad that the head of campus security where she worked, quote, reached out to offer her an escort because they feared one of these keyboard soldiers might step out of his basement and come do her harm, end quote. And her post goes on to detail how many others have faced similar treatment by the Kirk mob, and that this is the culture of violence that Charlie Kirk built. And I fully agree with that. The pretense of free speech and the free exchange of ideas that he practiced while sitting under a sign saying "Prove me wrong" was just content. He said inflammatory things about minorities in order to bait college kids into reactions he could monetize on YouTube. The real political work of Charlie Kirk was, as Patton details in her post, targeted harassment of political enemies that were put on a list. I like her closing statement, so let me just read it verbatim before we move on to the next section of the video. Quote, "What I find especially jarring is the dissonance in public mourning for a smug white man whose life work was actively hostile to certain groups. Kirk spent years demonizing LGBTQ people, mocking gun survivors, spewing racism about black folks, and pushing policies that literally shorten lives. It is so revolting to watch a bipartisan wave of grief sweep over this hateful racist as if he was a neutral community servant," end quote. Indeed, at a time when neither liberals nor conservatives are able to muster up the humanity to empathize with murdered children in Gaza, somehow they all managed to cry for white nationalist Charlie Kirk. Before we continue with the second half of the video, I just want to say that you can help me grow this channel for free simply by subscribing, pressing the like button, leaving a comment down below, and if the video is still less than a week old by the time you're watching this, hyping it. I want to build an audience, but in a world that moves very fast, it's difficult to get noticed with pretty slow video essays that don't always deal with trending topics. I'd be eternally grateful for your help. Now, back to the content. But what then about the European far-right, because that's what I really wanted to talk about. Well, the far-right coalition in the European Parliament wanted to hold a silent minute for Charlie, an American political commentator, which they were denied, and then they started banging their desks in protest. The far-right coalition also nominated him for the most prestigious human rights prize of the European Union, the Sakharov Prize, because who deserves a human rights prize more than a frickin' white nationalist? Surely, famous white nationalist Charlie Kirk, who said that the 1964 Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination based on race was a mistake, is just as deserving of this human rights prize as, checks notes, Nelson Mandela, the guy who fought against apartheid in South Africa. So this is weird, right? That the European far right is mourning an American political commentator, not just an American political commentator, but an America first, Europe last American political commentator, an adversary of the Europe that European fascists ostensibly fight for. But in reality, European fascists are just completely subservient to American fascism and American interests, and I feel like they should be a little bit embarrassed about that. Not just in my political framework as a radical left lunatic, where it's embarrassing to be a fascist at all, but in theirs as well. Because in their political framework, they idealize fighting for their own glorious states, their own glorious cultures, and their own glorious peoples, their deranged ideas about all of those things anyway. But they don't do that, do they? They don't live their expressed values. European fascists aren't fighting to preserve their ideas of their own cultures. Instead, they fight for this vague Americentric culture of the West. Maybe 20 years ago, European fascists ostensibly stood for European culture, or their insane ideas about European culture. But today, European fascists are just American bootlickers who import their entire identity and ideology from across the Atlantic, and that is just so embarrassing. To give you one example, just take the word woke. The European far right now talks about things being woke. Everything is woke. This is woke. That is woke. And like, what the fuck are you talking about? Woke as in the African American word woke? Woke as in the African American word woke that has been co-opted by American fascists to gesture at everything they deem degenerate in American society. Fascists are ideologically incapable of creating anything. They can only ever imitate, but it's especially embarrassing when they don't even pretend to pull from the European cultures they claim to want to preserve. Instead, they displace their beloved European cultures with empty Americana. I don't often see explicit fascists out and about in Sweden, but when I do, they always fly the Confederate flag, a symbol of the slave colonies in America. European cultures are dying because of immigration, they say, as they murder their own deranged cultures with bland American imports. I've learned a lot about my own ideology from American leftists and socialists, no doubt. But I've never claimed to represent an ideology that puts my country or my people or my culture above everyone else. Socialism is international because proletarians exist everywhere. Capital knows no borders, and so socialists can't either. And also, I don't really like borders conceptually anyway, because I want to build a world that is less fractured, that is pulled together with understanding and mutual respect instead of splintered because of arbitrary lines on a map. But European fascists are people who claim to want to put their countries or their peoples or their cultures first. And then they cheer for Americans who want America first, Europe last, and that's because fascist ideology isn't actually about preserving or protecting their countries or their peoples or their cultures. It is only ever about hate. It's never America first, it's never Europe first. It's always hate first. Thank you for listening. Like, hype, comment, subscribe, and enjoy this footage of my cats while I go back to working on a real video essay instead of this mini sort of essay. Yep. Knock knock. Who's there? I don't know, a good knock knock joke. Knock knock. Who's there? I don't know. I don't know who. Well, how am I supposed to tell you? I just told you I don't know. But you're... Miffles? Are you behind her? No. I see a pair of eyes. What the heck are you doing, Miffles? I see a pair of eyes. Hello, Miffles. Don't mind the garbage here. What the heck are you doing, Miffles? Alright, let's get back to recording. Weirdo. As a radical left lunatic, are you just staring at me? Yeah, I got a little awkward, didn't it?